I never imagined that my life would take such a dramatic turn. My name is Fernanda, and this is the story of how my world turned upside down in a matter of months. It all started when I was 20 years old, and I married Ricardo, the man I believed to be the love of my life. Ricardo and I met at university. It was love at first sight. He was handsome, intelligent, and had a smile that lit up the whole room. We fell madly in love, and after years of dating, we decided to get married. We were young and naive, convinced that our love could overcome any obstacle. The first years of our marriage were like a dream. We lived in a small apartment in the center of São Paulo. We both worked and studied and spent every moment free together. We laughed, we made plans for the future, and we loved each other with an intensity that I believed to be indestructible. However, reality began to hit us little by little. Responsibilities increased, money became scarce, and stress accumulated. Ricardo got a job in an advertising agency that required long hours of work while I finished my nursing studies and worked part-time in a clinic. Little by little, the distance between us began to grow. Conversations became shorter, romantic dinners became less frequent, and arguments about money became more and more common. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that all couples went through difficult moments. It was then that life dealt us an even harder blow. Ricardo lost his job. The company he worked for declared bankruptcy, and overnight we found ourselves with only one source of income and a lot of debt. The tension in our house became unbearable. Ricardo fell into a deep depression. He spent whole days on the sofa watching television and drinking beer. I tried to cheer him up. I helped him look for work, but nothing seemed to work. I felt increasingly alone and frustrated. It was at that moment that Ricardo mentioned his father, Antonio. He had never talked much about him before. I knew they didn't have a good relationship and hadn't seen each other for years. However, in our desperation, Ricardo suggested asking him for financial help. I remember the day Antonio arrived. A tortoise if it were yesterday. It was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes incredibly similar to Ricardo's. His presence filled our small living room, and I could feel the tension in the air as father and son looked at each other. After so many years, Antonio agreed to help us financially, but with one condition: he wanted to stay with us for a while to supervise how we spent the money. Ricardo was furious, but we had no other option, so suddenly our small apartment became a home for three. Antonio's arrival coincided with a go. I asked Ricardo for luck. He got a new one. Job at an advertising agency in a nearby city, Campinas. The job required him to travel constantly, sometimes for days. On the one hand, I was happy for him, as he seemed to be regaining his confidence. On the other hand, I felt even more alone and abandoned during these long Ricardo's absences, that I began to get to know Antonio better. At first, our relationship was tense and formal, but little by little we started talking more. Antonio was a good listener and surprisingly gave good advice. I found myself sharing with him my concerns about my marriage, my frustrated dreams, and my fears for the future. One night while we had dinner together, Ricardo was traveling as usual. Antonio looked into my eyes and said, "Fernanda, you are an extraordinary woman. You deserve to be happy." These simple words touched something deep inside me. For the first time in a long time, I truly felt valued. The days passed, and my relationship with Antonio became closer and closer. I began to notice things about him that I had previously ignored. His sense of humor, his intelligence, the way his eyes sparkled when he talked about something he was passionate about. I found myself looking forward to the moments we spent together. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ricardo deteriorated, even more when he was at home. We barely talked. He spent most of his time working on his computer or going out with his new colleagues. I tried to talk to him several times about our problems, but he always found an excuse to avoid the conversation. It was on one of Ricardo's trips that everything changed. I received a call from an unknown number. It was a woman. Her voice was shaking as she asked me if I was Ricardo's wife. My heart sank. I knew what was coming. Before even she said, the woman through tears told me that she had been having an affair with Ricardo for the last 6 months. She told me that he had promised to leave. He had said that our marriage was over. Every word was like a stab in my heart. I hung up the phone and broke down on the kitchen floor, sobbing uncontrollably. It was Antonio who found me like that. Without saying a word, he hugged me and held me while I cried. At that moment, I felt a connection with him that I had never experienced before. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. I confronted Ricard. Oh, and he turned and he denied everything at first, but when I showed him what the other woman had sent me, he finally confessed. His face of guilt and shame didn't give me any satisfaction. I just felt an immense emptiness in the midst of all this emotional chaos. Antonio was my rock. He helped me, listening, consoled me, and gave me strength to move forward. Little by little, my feelings for him began to change. I no longer saw him just as Ricardo's father or as a friend. I began to see him as a man who made me feel alive and valued. A night, while Ricardo was away on another of his trips, Antonio and I were sitting on the sofa watching a movie. Suddenly, our eyes met, and without thinking, we kissed. It was a kiss full of contained passion and repressed desire. When we separated, we were both out of breath and surprised by what had just happened. "This is wrong," I said, although my body screamed otherwise. "I know," Antonio replied, "but I never felt so alive." From that moment on, our relationship turned into a passionate affair. We met in secret, stealing moments of intimacy. When Ricardo wasn't, I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I couldn't help it. Antonio made me feel wanted, appreciated, and loved in a way that Ricardo hadn't done in years. Guilt was eating me up inside every time I saw Ricardo. I felt like I was carrying a sign screaming "unfaithful" on my face. But at the same time, I couldn't deny my feelings for Antonio. It was as if I had discovered a part of myself that had been dormant for years. Things became even more complicated when Ricardo, apparently sorry for his infidelity, began to make an attempt to reconcile in gym. With me, he brought me flowers, invited me to dinner, even suggested we go to couples therapy, but each gesture only made me feel more guilty and confused. One night, after a particularly tense dinner with Ricardo, I slipped away to a nearby hotel. As we lay in bed holding each other, I confessed to everyone my fears and doubts. "I don't know what to do." Antonio said between tears, "I love Ricardo, or at least I love the man he used to be, but what I feel for you is something I've never experienced before." Antonio looked into my eyes and said, "Fernanda, I love you, and if you decide to stay with Ricardo, I will understand. But I want you to know that I am willing to give everything for you, even if it means facing my own son." Your words moved me deeply for the first time in a long time. I felt that someone was putting me first, that someone was willing to fight for me. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions. Ricardo continued trying to reconcile. But every time I looked at them all, I think about Wash's betrayal and my own feelings for Antonio. The tension at home was palpable, and I knew that sooner or later everything would explode. And soon night, Ricardo came back early from a trip and found Metal King on the phone with Antonio. I don't know exactly what he heard, but it was enough to make him lose control, and he started shouting at me, accusing me of being a traitor and throwing things across the room. Antonio, who was downstairs, heard the commotion and ran upstairs. What followed was a violent confrontation between father and son. Shouting, insults, and accusations flew through the air. Ricardo, blind with rage, tried to hit me, but Antonio intervened, receiving the blow in my place. Seeing Antonio defending me, risking his relationship with his son for me, was the turning point. At that moment, I knew I couldn't continue living like this. I couldn't continue in a loveless marriage based on lies and mutual relationships. With tears in my eyes, I looked at Ricardo and said, "It's over, I can't goon with this." Ricardo looked at me, a mixture of anger and pain in his eyes. "Is it because of him?" Hess, pointing at Antonio. "You leave me for my own father?" "I leave you because we're no longer happy together." I answered, "Because we both make mistakes and hurt each other and love Antonio, but that's not the reason why I'm ending our marriage. I'm ending it because he no longer exists." The next few hours were chaos. Ricardo was screaming, crying, begging, Antonio trying to calm him down, but I could only get angry. But finally I made a drastic decision. I packed some of my things in a suitcase and walked out the door, leaving behind years of my life and a marriage that had fallen apart. Antonio followed me. We got into his care and drove aimlessly for hours, processing everything that there was. Finally happened. We stopped up at a small motel on the outskirts of São Paulo that night. As we were laying on the motel bed, Antonio took my hand and said, "Fernanda, I know this is not easy. I know there is a lot of and confusion, but I want you to know that I am here for you. No matter what happens, if you want to try this with me, I'm willing to give it my all. But if I need time and space, I'll understand." Your words touched me deeply. For the first time, I felt like someone really saw me, valued me, and respected me as a person. Just as a wife or lover, Antonio, I said, "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know I want to find out that with the following months they weren't easy. I had to face the judgment of friends and family who didn't understand my decision. Ricardo, hurt and angry, did everything possible to make things difficult for us during the divorce process. There were times when I doubted my decision, when the guilt threatened to consume me, but Antonio was by my side every step of the way. He supported me when I had to move and start over from scratch, encouraged me when I got a new one as a nurse in a hospital in Campinas, held me when the nights were long and the memories were painful. Little by little, we started to build a life together. It wasn't easy. The age difference was sometimes challenged, and we had to learn to communicate and trust each other in a way that neither of us had experienced before. There were difficult times. So of course, the first time we met Ricardo in public, it was incredibly comfortable. The disapproving looks from some of our acquaintances were hard to ignore. That sometimes, in the silence of the night, I wondered if I had made the right decision, but then I looked at Antonio, I saw the love in his eyes. I felt the warmth of his embrace, and I knew I had found something special, something worth fighting for. Now, years later, I can go back and see how that turbulent time in my life led me to where I am today. Antonio and I remain together, stronger than ever. We'll learn to face challenges together, communicate openly, and to cherish every moment we have. Ricardo eventually found peace and forgiveness, though our relationship will never be same again. We managed to reach a place of mutual respect. He even started to rebuild his relationship with Antonio, something I never thought would be possible looking back. I realized that my story is not just about infidelity or betrayal. It is a story about growth, about learning to value yourself, about the courage to seek happiness. Even when the path is difficult, I don't regret the decisions I made. Every experience, every pain, every moment of doubt led me to where I am now, taught me lessons about love, loyalty, and the importance of being true to yourself. Today, at 40 years old, I can say that I am truly happy, Antonio, and I have built a life together that surpasses anything I could have imagined. Our relationship is based on mutual respect, trust, and a deep understanding of each other. From years we adopted a girl. Julia. Being a mother was a dream that I had abandoned during my marriage with Ricardo, but with Antonio I found the courage to pursue it again. Seeing Antonio as such a loving and dedicated father added a new dimension to our love. Our life is not perfect. Of course, we still face challenges. The age differences sometimes makes itself noticeable, especially when it comes to raising Julia. There are times when our perspectives hurt due to our different life experiences, but we have learned to see these differences as a strength, not as an obstacle. Ricardo continues being part of our lives, although in a very different way than I ever imagined. Over time, the pain and anger dissipated, giving way to a cordial relationship. He even became a kind of uncle to Julia, something that fills me with a strange mixture of gratitude and nostalgia. A few months ago, we met Ricardo in Ibirapuera Park. He was with his new girlfriend, a charming woman who seems to make him really happy. While we watched Julia play on the swings, Ricardo approached me and said something that I will never forget. Fernanda, I know our story is not over as we expected, but I want you to know that I am grateful the years we shared, for the lessons we learned together. And yes, even for it all ended, because it led us to where we're now, and I think we're both where. Wes should be. Your words moved me deeply. I realized that despite it all, the pain and confusion, our experiences took us to a place of understanding and forgiveness that I would never have believed possible. That night, as Antonio and I put Julia to sleep, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey that has been my life since the naive young girl who became married at 20 years old, going from the wounded and confused woman who fell in love with her husband's father to the person I am today, a strong woman, self-assured and deeply loved. I looked at Antonio with a few extra gray hairs, but with the same warm eyes that gave me captivated years ago, and I felt a wave of love and gratitude. What are you thinking about? Asked, noticing my thoughtful look as in us. I responded, in everything we went through together. Antonio took my hand and kissed it. Awfully, every moment was worth it, they said, because he brought us here to this moment with you and Julia, and he was right. Every tear shed, every moment of doubt, every obstacle overcome brought us to this point, to a life full of love, respect, and genuine happiness. My story is a testimony that love, it can emerge in the most unexpected places, that happiness sometimes requires making difficult decisions, and that forgiveness of both others and yourself is the path to true freedom. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that whatever happens, I will face every challenge with the strength and wisdom I gained throughout this journey, and I will do this with Antonio by side, with Julia in our hearts, and with the certainty that despite all the twists and turns, I found my true home. As I write these words, I feel a deep peace of mind. Life was not easy, and it certainly did not follow the path I imagined, but each experience, each decision shaped me into the person I am today, a person I am proud of. Sometimes when I look at Antonio sleeping next to me, or when I see Julia laughing while playing in the garden, I feel a wave of emotion so intense that it leaves me breathless. It is in these moments that I realize that everything, the pain, the confusion, the tears, was worth it, because it brought me here to this moment, to this life that, although imperfect, is deeply beautiful in its authenticity. And so I close this chapter of my story. I find myself excited about what's to come, because if I've learned anything from all of this, it's that life always has surprises in store, and I'm ready to face them all with love in my heart and hope in my eyes. This is my story, a story of love, betrayal, forgiveness, and redemption, a story that reminds me every day that true love, the love that sees you for who you really are, the love that challenges you to be the best version of yourself, is possible, and that sometimes you find it in the most unexpected place.